In the dense jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, from 1966 to 1971, there operated a force so feared by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army that they gave them a special name, Ma Rung, the Ghosts of the Jungle. These were not large American infantry units sweeping through the countryside with helicopters and artillery support. These were not search and destroy missions with hundreds of soldiers. These were 5 men, just 5 Australian Special Air Service Regiment troopers, moving silently through enemy-controlled territory for days or weeks at a time, seeing everything, reporting everything, and when they made contact, unleashing hell with a ferocity that made the enemy believe they were facing a much larger force. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong learned to fear the Australians in a way they feared no other forces in Vietnam. When communist military histories were written after the war, they referred to all Australian infantry as Biet Keech, commandos, because they operated in such small units with such devastating effectiveness. But the actual SASR troops, they called them phantoms, ghosts, because by the time you knew they were there, it was already too late. For the 580 men who served with the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in Vietnam, the experience of long-range patrol was unlike anything American soldiers typically encountered. This was not the war of big battles and fire-based defences. This was intimate, personal, and psychologically crushing in ways that only men who have spent weeks in enemy territory with 4 other soldiers can truly understand. This is the story of what it was like to be a ghost in the jungle of Vietnam. The Australian military commitment to Vietnam began small. Military advisors arrived in 1962 as part of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. They worked alongside American Special Forces, training South Vietnamese units, going on operations with them, earning respect from their American counterparts for their professionalism and combat effectiveness. In April 1966, Australia committed the first Australian task force to Vietnam. This was a self-contained brigade-sized force of 2 infantry battalions, later expanded to 3, along with armour, artillery, engineers, and all the support elements needed for sustained operations. The task force was based at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, about 60 kilometres southeast of Saigon. Phuoc Tuy was not the most famous province in Vietnam. It did not see the massive battles that occurred around Saigon or in the Central Highlands or at Khe Sanh. But it was crucial territory, it sat astride key supply routes, it contained rubber plantations that generated revenue for whoever controlled them, and it was heavily infiltrated by Viet Cong forces who used the thick jungle and the long high hills and the Mae Tao Mountains as bases from which to threaten Saigon and surrounding areas. The first Australian task force was given responsibility for securing Phuoc Tuy Province. That was the mission. Take control of a province from the Viet Cong, protect the population, cut off enemy supply routes, and destroy communist military forces operating in the area. To accomplish this mission, the Australians needed intelligence. They needed to know where the enemy was, how many there were, what they were doing, where they were going. They needed eyes and ears deep in the jungle, in areas where conventional infantry could not operate without being detected. That was the mission of the Special Air Service Regiment. 3 SASR squadrons rotated through Vietnam on 1-year deployments from 1966 through 1971. 1st Squadron, 2nd Squadron, and 3rd Squadron each completed 2 tours. Each squadron had a New Zealand SAS troop attached, integrating Kiwi operators into Australian patrols, creating an Anzac Special Operations Force that would become legendary. The squadrons were based on SAS Hill at Nui Dat, a position overlooking the task force base. From there, they launched patrols throughout Phuoc Tuy and into neighbouring provinces, Bien Hoa, Long Khan, Binh Tuy. Anywhere the task force needed intelligence, the SAS went. A typical SASR patrol consisted of 5 men, just 5. In a war where American infantry companies operated with over 100 men, where platoons had 30 or 40 soldiers, the Australians were putting 5-man teams into the jungle for missions lasting days or weeks. The patrol commander was usually a sergeant or corporal. He made all tactical decisions, planned the patrol route, decided when to move and when to stop, when to engage the enemy and when to hide. The second in command was the patrol medic, responsible for treating casualties if the patrol made contact. The scout walked point, leading the patrol through the jungle, watching for enemy soldiers and booby traps. The signaller carried the radio, maintaining contact with headquarters, calling in reports, requesting extraction if things went wrong. The fifth man was typically armed with an M60 machine gun, providing the patrol's primary firepower. 5 men, carrying everything they would need for the entire patrol: ammunition, water, rations, radio batteries, medical supplies, demolitions if they were planning to ambush enemy forces or destroy supply caches. The weight was crushing, often over 30 kilograms per man in addition to weapons and equipment. They inserted by helicopter, usually at first light. The Iroquois helicopters of No. 9 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force worked closely with the SAS, developing techniques for rapid insertion into small jungle clearings. The helicopter would come in fast and low, hover just long enough for the 5 men to jump out, then climb away immediately. Total time on the ground, seconds. The goal was to get the patrol inserted before the enemy could react, before anyone in the area knew Australians had arrived. From the moment they hit the ground, the patrol was alone, 5 men in enemy-controlled territory, no artillery support close enough to help if they made contact, no quick reaction force that could reach them in minutes. If they got into trouble, their only option was to run and fight until a helicopter could extract them, and helicopter extractions under fire were always dangerous. The first thing the patrol did after insertion was move away from the landing zone. They never stayed near where the helicopter dropped them. The enemy knew that if they heard a helicopter in the jungle, troops had probably been inserted. Viet Cong and NVA forces would converge on helicopter insertion points, trying to find the patrol before it could disperse into the jungle, so the patrol moved. Silent, slow, deliberate movement through the densest jungle they could find. They were not trying to cover distance, they were trying to disappear. They wanted to become invisible, to blend into the jungle so completely that enemy forces could walk past them without knowing they were there. For the men on these patrols, the psychological stress began immediately and never stopped until extraction. You were being hunted. You knew it. The enemy controlled this territory. They knew the trails, the water sources, the likely positions for observation posts. They had more men. If they found you, you were outnumbered. Your only advantages were surprise, firepower, and the training that made you better at jungle warfare than anyone else in Vietnam. The silence was crushing. SASR patrols operated under strict noise discipline. No talking. Communication was by hand, signals only. You could not cough, could not sneeze, could not make any sound that might give away your position. If you needed to tell your patrol commander something, you wrote it on a piece of paper, or whispered so quietly that a man 3 meters away could not hear you. Imagine that. Days in the jungle without speaking. Just the sounds of the jungle around you. Insects, birds, monkeys. The occasional crack of a distant gunfire or the thump of artillery from Nui Dat, and the constant awareness that the enemy was out there, hunting you, and if they found you first, you were probably going to die. The patrols moved at a glacial pace. Conventional infantry might cover several kilometers per day. SASR patrols moved meters per hour. Every step had to be carefully placed. You watched where you put your feet, avoiding dry leaves that might crackle, branches that might snap. You moved through the thickest vegetation, not around it, because the enemy used the trails and the easy routes. If you stayed in the thick stuff, you were less likely to be spotted. The patrol formation was critical. The scout led, usually 3 to 5 meters ahead, eyes constantly scanning for enemy soldiers, booby traps, ambush positions. Behind him came the patrol commander making decisions, watching the scout, monitoring the patrol's progress. The signaller followed, protecting the radio, the patrol's lifeline to headquarters. The medic came next, ready to treat casualties. The machine gunner brought up the rear, watching the patrol's back trail, ready to provide covering fire if they made contact. Navigation through dense jungle with no visible landmarks was a skill that took years to master. The patrol commander used a combination of compass, map, and dead reckoning, counting paces, noting terrain features, constantly updating his position. Getting lost in enemy territory was a death sentence. You had to know where you were at all times, know the route to the nearest extraction point, know where friendly artillery could reach if you needed fire support. The heat was unbearable. Phuoc Tuy province was hot and humid year-round. Temperatures regularly reached 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. The humidity made it feel even hotter. You wore full combat gear, carried heavy loads, moved through jungle so thick the sunlight barely penetrated. You sweated constantly. Water was precious. You could not afford to run out. Dehydration could kill you as surely as enemy bullets. The patrols carried water in canteens, rationing it carefully, A patrol might go out for 7 days with only enough water for 3 or 4. After that, they had to find water in the jungle. Streams, creeks, bomb craters filled with rainwater. They purified it with iodine tablets, which made it taste terrible but killed the bacteria that could cause dysentery. Drinking contaminated water could incapacitate a man, and a sick man on patrol was a liability the team could not afford. The insects were relentless. Mosquitoes, leeches, ants, spiders, centipedes. They crawled on you, bit you, burrowed into your skin. You could not slap at them. That would make noise. You had to let them bite you, let the leeches attach and feed, deal with it during rest halts when you could carefully remove them without making sound. Sleep was almost impossible. The patrol stopped at night, found a position in thick cover, set up a defensive perimeter with each man facing outward. They would rest in shifts, 2 men awake at all times, watching and listening. But you never really slept. You dozed, fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. Your mind played tricks on you. The jungle at night was full of sounds that could be enemy soldiers, or could be animals, or could be nothing. You never knew. So you stayed alert, heart pounding, weapon ready, waiting for the moment when the silence erupted into violence. Fear was constant. Every veteran of SASR patrols talks about the fear, not the sudden fear of contact, of enemy soldiers appearing and bullets flying. That kind of fear was almost a relief because at least you could do something, could fight back. The fear on patrol was different. It was slow, grinding, relentless. It built up over days. The fear of being discovered, the fear of ambush, the fear that you'd been compromised, that the enemy knew where you were and was maneuvering to surround you. The fear that extraction would not come, that you would be left behind, sis alone in the jungle with the enemy closing in. The patrols gathered intelligence. That was the primary mission. They watched enemy trails, counting troops, noting what equipment they carried, recording which direction they moved. They found base camps, noting the number of bunkers, the layout of defensive positions, the locations of supply caches. They listened to enemy radio traffic if they could intercept it. They looked for signs of recent activity, fresh footprints, newly cut vegetation, discarded ration tins, cigarette butts. All of this information was radioed back to headquarters at Nui Dat. The signaller would establish communication at scheduled times, using encrypted brevity codes to minimize transmission time. Long radio transmissions could be direction found by enemy signals intelligence. Every time the patrol transmitted, there was risk, so they kept it short. Brief situation reports, enemy sightings, request for extraction if the mission was complete or if they had been compromised. Sometimes the patrols set ambushes. If intelligence indicated that enemy forces were using a particular trail, an SASR patrol might be inserted to ambush them. The patrol would find a good position along the trail, usually where the jungle was thickest and the trail narrowed, forcing the enemy to bunch up. They would set claymore mines, position the machine gun for maximum effect, establish fields of fire. Then they would wait. Hours, sometimes days, waiting for the enemy to walk into the kill zone. And when they came, when Viet Cong soldiers walked onto that trail, the patrol would detonate the claymores and open fire with everything they had. The violence was sudden, overwhelming, shocking in its intensity. The M60 machine gun firing 600 rounds per minute, M16 rifles on full automatic, claymore mines detonating with a blast that shredded everything in the kill zone. The goal was to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible in the first seconds, before they could react, before they could return effective fire. And then the patrol would break contact. They would not stay to fight a prolonged engagement. 5 men could not stand against an enemy force of platoon or company strength. They hit hard, inflicted casualties, and ran. They moved through the jungle using pre-planned escape routes, putting distance between themselves and the ambush site as quickly as possible, while still maintaining noise discipline and tactical movement. The technique for breaking contact was practiced endlessly in training. The machine gunner would lay down suppressive fire while the rest of the patrol moved to the first rally point. Then the machine gunner would displace, moving through the patrol to a position ahead of them, and someone else would provide cover. Leapfrogging back through the jungle, each man covering the others, maintaining fire superiority even while retreating. The weight of fire an SASR patrol could generate was remarkable for such a small unit. 5 men with M16 rifles, an M60 machine gun, M79 grenade launchers, and often extra ammunition in claymore bags could produce firepower equivalent to a full infantry platoon for short periods. This was by design. The goal was to make the enemy think they had encountered a much larger force, to create confusion and hesitation that the patrol could exploit to escape. The enemy would pursue sometimes. Viet Cong and NVA forces hated the Australian SAS with a passion. They wanted revenge. They wanted to kill these ghosts who ambushed their patrols and disappeared into the jungle. So they would organise pursuit forces trying to track the patrol, trying to corner them. SASR patrols became experts at escape and evasion. They used every trick they knew. They moved through the thickest jungle. They doubled back on their trails. They set booby traps behind them, claymores rigged to command detonation, waiting until pursuit forces reached the right spot and then triggering the mine remotely. They called in artillery strikes danger close, shells landing within a few hundred meters of their own position, forcing the enemy to take cover while the patrol moved. If things got really bad, if the patrol was cornered or pursued by a force too large to evade, they called for extraction. Emergency extraction. And that was when things got truly terrifying. The helicopters from No. 9 Squadron would come in under fire. The patrol would pop smoke to mark their position. Purple smoke usually, the recognition signal changing regularly to prevent the enemy from using it to deceive the helicopters. The Iroquois would come in fast, the door gunners firing their M60 machine guns, suppressing enemy positions around the landing zone. The patrol would break from the jungle, running for the helicopter, laying down covering fire. 5 men against however many enemy soldiers were in the area, firing and moving, and trying to get to the helicopter before they were cut down. Men were hit. Men went down. The patrol never left anyone behind. If a man was wounded, they carried him. If a man was killed, they carried his body. No one was left for the enemy to capture or desecrate. The helicopter would hover, unable to land in the thick jungle, the skids just above the ground or caught in the vegetation. The patrol would throw their wounded aboard, climb in themselves, the helicopter straining to lift off with the added weight. Enemy rounds would punch through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. Sometimes helicopters were shot down during these extractions. Pilots and crew would be killed. But they kept coming. They never abandoned an SASR patrol. Between 1966 and 1971, SASR squadrons conducted approximately 1,200 combat patrols in Vietnam. 1,200 times, 5 men inserted into enemy territory, gathered intelligence, hunted the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army, and came back alive. The statistics are almost unbelievable. Over 5 years of continuous operations, the SASR killed at least 492 enemy soldiers with confirmed body counts. Other estimates put the number closer to 600. The highest kill ratio of any unit in the entire Vietnam War. And their own casualties? 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 killed by friendly fire, 1 missing in action, 1 death from illness. Total, 7 deaths over 5 years. Another 28 wounded. 7 deaths in 5 years of operating deep behind enemy lines in small patrols. For comparison, American long-range reconnaissance patrol units suffered casualty rates of 20 to 30%. The SASR lost just over 1% killed in action. How did they do it? How did 5-man patrols operating alone in enemy-controlled territory survive when so many other special operations forces suffered devastating losses? The answer was training, discipline, and tactical excellence. The men selected for SASR were the best soldiers Australia had. The selection course was brutal, designed to break anyone who did not have the physical endurance, mental toughness, and tactical ability to survive long-range patrol operations. Most candidates failed. Those who passed underwent months of additional training in jungle warfare, navigation, survival, radio procedures, weapons handling, and the specific tactics used on patrol. They trained until these skills became instinctive. They trained until 5 men could communicate without words, move as a single organism through the jungle, react to contact with coordinated precision. They trained until they could operate for weeks on minimal sleep, minimal food, maximum stress without making the mistakes that got people killed, and they were disciplined. SASR patrols followed their training religiously. They did not take unnecessary risks. They did not deviate from tested procedures. When the patrol commander said move slowly, you moved slowly. When noise discipline was in effect, you made no noise. When the order came to break contact, you broke contact. You did not stay to fight unless there was no other option. This discipline saved lives. There are stories from American long-range patrol units of teams getting into firefights they could have avoided, of patrols taking casualties because they violated noise discipline or failed to properly clear the area after insertion. The Australians rarely made these mistakes. They were professionals. They did the job right. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army learned to fear the Australians. Communist military documents from the war refer to the psychological impact of SASR patrols. They knew the Australians were out there, somewhere in the jungle watching. They knew that trails they used regularly might have an SASR patrol waiting in ambush. They knew that if they heard the distinctive sound of M16 rifles firing on full automatic combined with M60 machine gun fire, it was probably a 5-man Australian patrol, and despite being only 5 men, those Australians would inflict terrible casualties before disappearing back into the jungle. The communists tried to counter SASR operations. They increased patrols in areas where Australian activity was suspected. They set up listening posts along likely infiltration routes. They tried to ambush the patrols to turn the tables on the hunters. By 1970, the Viet Cong had learned SASR insertion techniques. They knew what to listen for: the sound of helicopters coming in low, the brief period when the aircraft was vulnerable during insertion. They began positioning forces near likely landing zones, ready to attack patrols immediately after insertion. The SASR adapted. They developed cowboy insertions. 2 helicopters would fly together. Both would land. Both would insert patrols. The patrols would move together for 5 minutes, then one patrol would stop and wait. If the enemy had tracked the insertion and was following, they would hit the first patrol and the second patrol could ambush them from behind. If no contact occurred, the second patrol would return to the landing zone and be extracted, while the first patrol continued its mission. This deceptive insertion technique helped reduce the number of patrols compromised immediately after landing. But even with perfect training and discipline, things sometimes went wrong. Men were killed. Not many, but enough that every SASR soldier knew the danger was real. Some deaths were in combat. Patrols making contact with larger enemy forces, fighting their way out, not everyone making it to the extraction helicopter. One patrol member killed in action. Another died of wounds after being evacuated. These were the deaths that made sense in war. Men fighting the enemy, taking fire, some dying despite everyone's best efforts to save them. But 3 SASR soldiers died from friendly fire. 3. Killed by other Australians or Allied forces in the chaos and confusion of jungle warfare. These deaths haunt the survivors more than combat deaths. When the enemy kills your friend, you can understand it. When friendly forces kill your friend because they did not recognize him, because communication broke down, because someone made a mistake, it is harder to accept. One death was particularly tragic. A soldier went out with a patrol that was not his regular team. He was bored waiting for his own patrol to return from a mission, so he volunteered to fill in with another patrol that needed an extra man. The patrol made contact. In the confusion and darkness and fear, he was shot and killed by another member of his patrol who mistook him for an enemy soldier. His friends knew him well. They had trained with him, deployed with him, but the patrol he was with did not know his methods, his movements. The small indicators that would have told his regular patrol members it was him and not the enemy. Familiarity saves lives on patrol. Operating with strangers, even highly trained strangers, increases risk. One SASR soldier went missing in action. During a helicopter extraction under fire, he fell while being pulled up on a rope. He fell into the jungle canopy and was not recovered. For decades, his family did not know what happened to him. His remains were finally discovered in 2008, nearly 40 years after he fell. He was brought home and buried with military honours. The psychological toll of long-range patrol operations was immense. The men who served with SASR in Vietnam came home changed. Some handled it better than others, but all of them carried the weight of those patrols for the rest of their lives. They remembered the fear, the constant grinding fear of being hunted in the jungle, the fear during insertion, wondering if the enemy was waiting, the fear during movement, wondering if the next step would trigger an ambush, the fear during rest halts, wondering if you had been compromised, if enemy soldiers were surrounding your position, the fear during extraction, running for the helicopter while bullets cracked past your head. They remembered the silence, days without speaking, the isolation of being one of 5 men alone in enemy territory, the feeling that if something went wrong, help was far away and might not arrive in time. They remembered the violence, the sudden explosions of combat when stealth failed and the patrol had to fight, the sound of machine guns firing, the blast of claymore mines, the screams of wounded enemy soldiers, the smell of blood and cordite, the aftermath, policing the battlefield, searching enemy bodies for intelligence documents while dead men lay around you. They remembered their friends who did not come home, the 7 men who died, the 28 who were wounded. They remembered carrying wounded men through the jungle to extraction points. They remembered the fear that they would be next, that the next patrol would be the one where they did not make it back, and they remembered the sense of purpose. Despite the fear and the stress and the losses, the men of SASR believed in what they were doing. They were providing intelligence that saved lives. Their patrols identified enemy forces, allowing artillery and airstrikes to hit them before they could attack Australian positions. Their ambushes disrupted enemy supply lines, preventing weapons and ammunition from reaching Viet Cong units. Their presence in the jungle forced the enemy to divert resources to security, to move more cautiously, to be afraid. The Australian infantry battalions at Nui Dat depended on SASR intelligence. When the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment fought the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, one of the most famous Australian engagements of the war, the intelligence that allowed them to prepare for the battle came partly from SASR patrols. When artillery needed targets, SASR provided grid coordinates. When the task force needed to know enemy strength and dispositions, SASR went into the jungle and found out. American forces respected the Australian SAS enormously. American long-range patrol units worked with them, learned from them, adopted some of their techniques. American helicopter pilots who flew SASR insertions and extractions knew these were professionals, men who knew what they were doing, men who would not panic when things went wrong. There are accounts from American advisors and special forces who served alongside SASR soldiers. They describe men who were quiet, confident, utterly professional, men who did not boast about their kills or their close calls, men who simply did the job day after day, patrol after patrol, with a level of skill and discipline that impressed even veteran American operators. The nickname Ma Rung, Ghosts of the Jungle, was not propaganda. It was what the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong actually called them. Communist forces feared the Australians in a way they did not fear most other units. They knew that if Australians were in an area, patrols were being watched, trails were being ambushed, intelligence was being gathered. They knew that Australian patrols were almost impossible to detect until it was too late, and they knew that when you did make contact with an SASR patrol, the violence would be sudden and overwhelming. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. The Viet Cong and NVA controlled most of the countryside in Phuoc Thu province when the Australians arrived. By 1968, after 2 years of sustained operations including SASR patrols, the Australians had largely pacified the province. The enemy still operated there, but they no longer controlled it. They moved cautiously, knowing they were being watched. They avoided areas where SASR patrols were active. They lost the sense of security they had once enjoyed. This was strategic effect achieved by small unit tactics. 5-man patrols, operating independently, created an effect far beyond their numerical strength. This is the value of elite forces properly employed. They force the enemy to react, to change behaviour, to divert resources, to be afraid. And fear is a weapon that goes beyond the immediate casualties inflicted. For American veterans who served in Vietnam, particularly those who operated with long-range patrol units or special operations forces, the story of the Australian SAS resonates. You understand what it means to operate in small teams deep in enemy territory. You understand the fear, the stress, the isolation. You understand the bond that forms between men who trust each other with their lives every day. You understand why the survivors do not talk much about their experiences, because words cannot capture what it was like. The numbers tell part of the story. 1,200 patrols, 600 enemy killed, 7 friendly killed in action. These are remarkable statistics. They demonstrate tactical excellence, superior training, disciplined execution of difficult missions in extremely dangerous conditions. But the real story is in the experiences of the individual soldiers. The 20-year-old corporal leading his first patrol, trying to project confidence while being terrified he will make a mistake that gets his men killed. The scout walking point. knowing he'll be the first to see the enemy and probably the first to get shot if they walk into an ambush. The signaller trying to establish radio communication while keeping the transmission brief enough to avoid enemy direction finding. The machine gunner knowing that if contact is made, his weapon will be the patrol's primary means of survival. The patrol commander making life or death decisions every day, trying to balance mission accomplishment against the safety of his men. These were not supermen. They were ordinary Australian soldiers who volunteered for extraordinary duty. They were trained to an exceptional standard and they performed to that standard under the most difficult conditions. They were afraid, but they did the job anyway. They were exhausted, but they kept going. They saw friends killed and wounded, but they went back on patrol. This is what separates elite forces from ordinary soldiers. Not superhuman abilities or immunity to fear, but the training and discipline to function effectively despite the fear, despite the exhaustion, despite the losses. To do the job when doing the job means putting yourself in danger every single day. The legacy of SASR operations in Vietnam extends far beyond the statistics. The lessons learned, the tactics developed, the reputation earned, all of these became part of the Australian military's institutional knowledge. The men who served in Vietnam went on to train the next generation of SASR soldiers. The techniques they developed for jungle patrol, for ambush, for extraction under fire, became standard procedure, and the reputation persisted. When Australian Special Operations Forces deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq decades later, they carried with them the legacy of Vietnam. They were the descendants of the ghosts of the jungle. They had standards to uphold, a tradition of excellence that demanded they be the best. For the Vietnamese who fought against them, the memory of Australian SAS operations remains vivid. In interviews conducted years after the war, former Viet Cong and NVA soldiers speak about the Australians with a mixture of respect and lingering fear. They remember patrols that seemed to appear from nowhere, ambushes that destroyed entire units, the sense that the jungle was no longer safe because the Australians were watching. This is the ultimate measure of effectiveness for Special Operations Forces. Not just how many enemy they kill, but how much they affect enemy behaviour. The SASR in Vietnam achieved that effect. They made the enemy afraid. They made the enemy change tactics. They made the enemy divert resources to counter them. And they did it with minimal losses to themselves, a testament to their skill and professionalism. The psychological cost was high. The men who served on these patrols paid a price that cannot be fully calculated. Some came home and adjusted. Some struggled with what they had experienced. Some suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1970s and 80s it was not well understood or treated. They had nightmares about the jungle, about being hunted, about friends dying. They struggled to explain to people who had not been there what it was like to spend weeks in enemy territory with 4 other men, knowing that if you were discovered you would probably die. But they also had pride. They knew what they had accomplished. They knew they had been part of something exceptional. They had served with the best under the most difficult conditions and they had succeeded. That knowledge, that pride in having done the job well, helped many of them cope with the memories. Today, the story of SASR operations in Vietnam is not as well known as it should be. The Battle of Long Tan gets more attention. The broader Australian commitment to Vietnam is sometimes forgotten in the shadow of the much larger American involvement. But among military historians, among special operations communities around the world, the Australian SAS in Vietnam is recognised as one of the most successful special operations campaigns ever conducted. 1,200 patrols over 5 years, 5-man teams operating deep in enemy territory, minimal casualties, maximum effect. This is special operations warfare at its finest. This is what elite forces properly trained, properly led and properly employed can accomplish. For the men who served, who walked point through the jungles of Phuoc Tuy, who set ambushes on enemy trails, who called in artillery strikes, who fought their way to extraction helicopters, who watched friends die and who somehow survived themselves, the memories never fade. The jungle is always there, in their minds. The fear is always there, controlled but never completely gone. The pride is there too, the knowledge that they were ghosts in the jungle and the enemy was right to fear them. They were 5 men against the jungle, against the enemy, against the fear, and they won. Not every time, not without losses, but in the aggregate over 5 years they won. They completed their missions, forged They gathered their intelligence, they killed the enemy, and most of them came home. That is the story of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in Vietnam. That is what it meant to be a ghost in the jungle, and for the men who lived it, it is a story that will stay with them for the rest of their lives.